Gina Scinta of Thales, it's great to see you again. Thanks for your time. A lot of discussion here about the intersection of data protection and zero trust architecture that the Defense Department's implementing. What's the message that, as you speak here, talking to people at your booth, talking to people like me, what do you want people to take away about that intersection and what's possible?
I mean, data is the biggest challenge in the zero trust architecture. I think from an identity perspective, they've kind of already got their plan for that and where they're going. And the sheer volume of data, because nobody ever gets rid of data, they just keep collecting more data, right? And to be able to put the appropriate controls around it, zero trust is all about, access and having that access and putting the controls around it to make sure that people that need the access have it and those that don't gain access to the information. And we've been in the data protection business for over 30 years. And there's different layers of how you protect that data. And, sometimes people look to just protect at the storage level, which is never sufficient because when the storage is up and running, it's susceptible to being stolen. And that's where, you need to put more protection. Who's going to have access, what type of layer of access they're going to have is going to be very important. And it's going to take time to figure it out.
What are the most important elements to consider as someone or some organization or some organizations together go about figuring that out, Gina?
It's knowing your data. Because if you don't know your data, you don't know what you want to protect and at what level you want to protect it at. And so that's part of the challenge is the knowledge of your data and trying to figure out how to protect it. There are tools on the market that can do data discovery so that you can say, okay, these are the types of data elements that I'm looking for, and I want to do a scan of the data that I have, whether it's in storage or, on a virtual machine or on a file server, and then be able to say, okay, now I know where my sensitive elements are. Now I can then put data protection around that through encryption and key management.
What are the most important elements to think about when one goes about analyzing that data? Is it just the level of protection that it requires because of the nature of its classification, or are there other elements to consider as well?
Level of classification is very important, but also how are you going to share the data, right? Because you may not want to share it with others, and the sensitivity is always the biggest aspect of it.
Yeah.
And what's sensitive to you might not be sensitive and important to me, right? And so it depends on, like what organization do you work for? What is your role or your job? Are you like an Intel analyst, or are you somebody doing, managing people's personal data like HR or healthcare records? So it's going to vary depending on what your role is and what type of data you're trying to access and control.
Where data is being shared, how important is it to understand what the other person, the other organization is doing regarding the curation and collation and classification of that data?
Yeah, so that's going to be really important because every time you share data somewhere else, especially when you're in a classified environment, it then could change the classification of the data. So you have to be very careful of that, knowing where it's going and who's going to have access to it as well.
What are the other issues that people here are talking about regarding that intersection of zero trust and data? What are the questions that they're asking, especially the C-Service folks?
Right. So like data, we're talking about data and people accessing data, and I'm talking about it from like a data at rest perspective. You also have to take into account data in motion. That data going out over the wire is just as susceptible to theft, if not more so. If somebody could tap a line, they could steal that data, right? Yeah. So being able to encrypt that data when it goes out over the wire, and so then it gets decrypted on the receiving end, you're now eliminating that vulnerability as well. So that's a big aspect of it too. You can't just think about where it resides, but where is it being transmitted to and from? And when you talk about where you transmit it to and from, think about, you could be at an enterprise data center somewhere, you could be doing it between the data center and the cloud, and then talk about the edge, right? So then you're out to the edge. You're not going to be able to send or share as much information because their resources are going to be limited. But they have to be able to protect that data at the edge when they're disconnected, right? And so then you have to think about the data protection layer you're doing at the edge as well. But when you reconnect, you have to be able to share what you've collected, kind of back to the home base, right? So yes. You have to think about that whole end-to-end data protection solution, not just when it's at rest, but also when it's in motion.
Gina, it's great to see you again. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this.